From Washington, D.C. to the Central Coast, this is Focus with Farr, where our representative in Washington hosts in-depth discussions of important issues of the day. And now, Congressman Sam Farr.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Focus with Farr. On the Central Coast, we understand that California is more than just big cities. It's full of rural areas like ours, whose local economies depend on strong agriculture sectors. Salinas Valley is one of the most strongest agricultural places in the world. As the #1 agriculture producing state that California is, we also know that when rural America prospers, the whole country prospers. However, not everyone in Washington gets that. Fortunately, our guest, the 30th Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, understands the importance of investing in rural America and has taken that message with him to Washington. Mr. Vilsack has been head of the Department of Agriculture. He's the first ever to chair the White House Rural Council. Is working hard to strengthen Americans' agricultural economy, to build vibrant rural communities, and create new markets for tremendous innovation in rural America. Prior to his appointment as Secretary, he served 2 terms as Governor of Iowa, in the Iowa State Senate, and as Mayor of Mount Pleasant, Iowa. So welcome to Focus with Farr. It's such a pleasure to have you here. You've been to my district. You walked the Salinas Valley and put on all the gear that we have to put on to make sure that our food is safe and secure. And
it's an extraordinarily productive area, and I think a lot of folks don't, when they think of California, they don't necessarily think of the rural parts or the agricultural parts of the state, but as you say, it's the #1 ag producer. And honestly, Congressman, that's tough for me to say because I come from Iowa, which seems to think of itself as a farm state.
We have, in California, I think we just counted, we had 18 products, 18 commodities, not commodities, but agricultural products that come out of California that don't grow in any other state. I think all the almonds in the country come out of California.
Right, and it's a tremendous export market. So not only are you helping to create farm income and rural income, but you're also helping to create jobs all over the country in terms of trade. So it's obviously a very, very important state from an agricultural perspective, and you're doing some extraordinary things, not just in growing agricultural products, but also changing the way Americans eat. And also some of the extraordinary research that's done. I know that's very important to you.
What I think is so wonderful about your appointment to Secretary of Agriculture is that you have an incredible background of understanding, how all politics is local. Being mayor of a small town, being a country lawyer, being in the Iowa State Senate and governor of that state for 2 terms. And in your own personal history, being born into an orphanage and struggling with finding all and through the adoption process. What a role model. But I think more importantly, how you so much appreciate the culture of rural communities and how the strength of America really is in this. And you've made some statements that I think are very impressive. You have about how much of our military service comes out of rural America.
Well, rural America now, unfortunately, has the smallest percentage of our country in its history, but it does disproportionately provide military to families. We have 16% of America's population, but nearly 40% of the military. So rural families send their sons and daughters off to war in the last 10 years, more frequently in greater numbers than any other place in the country. And I think a lot of it has to do with the value system that's so important and I think central to growing up in a rural area. Your farmers and your growers and producers know something very basic, which is that the land is valuable and you have to give something back to it in order for it to continue to give to you. And I think the young people who grow up around that value system understand that a country that gives us extraordinary freedom and liberty that we enjoy in this country, that you have to give something back to it. And so they do it through the service, through the military.
I find it's also much more of a struggle because you just don't have all the amenities, and you're living out in the country. You just don't have a store to run to if you're short on something.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's a very good observation. Rural folks are problem solvers, which is why when the tractor breaks down or the combine breaks down from my home state, people don't whine about it. They just figure out how to fix it. And sometimes it's a little baling wire and some duct tape, but they get the job done. And I think they expect that of us here in Washington, which is why it's important for us to continue to focus on getting the job done, whether it's passing a 5-year farm program or dealing with the important immigration bill that's currently being considered by Congress.
Well, of all the secretaries in this city, you have probably the biggest agenda right now and of what's really happening in Congress. I mean, the biggest, obviously, immigration, and how much of that is related to agriculture and the need for our labor force. And we certainly see it in Monterey County, Santa Cruz, where I am, all of California. But it's also the Farm Bill, which is the writing of all the laws that give you the authorities to operate the Department of Agriculture, and those are done about every 5 years, and we're in the process of putting that package together.
Well, I like to refer to it as a food, farm, and jobs bill because it's all three of those things. It clearly is a food bill because of the important nutrition assistance programs that are contained in the bill, not just for struggling families, but also for farmers and producers. I mean, 15 to 16 cents of every food dollar that's spent in a grocery store or restaurant ends up in a farmer's pocket at the end of the day, and so it is part of that safety net that's important to producers. So that's why I'm concerned, and I'm sure you are as well, some of the steep cuts that are being proposed in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program will directly affect not just those struggling families, but also those grocery stores and everybody that in the supply chain, as well as farmers. You're talking about a cut of $2 to $3 billion in farm income when you talk about reducing SNAP as some folks have suggested by $20 billion.
Yeah, that's where there are these big programs, which food expenditure programs, SNAP being the biggest. But as you know, you administer WIC and what we've worked on, the school lunch program and all the feeding in schools. I mean, I hope that we come out of this with all of the things you're working on and the rural council that you're in charge of with all the agencies, is an understanding that in order to grow a healthier America, we've got to really start having people consume healthy foods. Unfortunately, that's all the stuff that we grow in our area is all about fresh and nutritious. It's mostly all the salad ingredients, but it's also a commitment to sustaining agriculture and sustaining a rural community so that the workforce will stay there. Those kids that are going off to the military usually aren't coming back to their hometowns because there's no Wi-Fi, they can't get access. They've learned skills, they've learned technical skills. And you've been a big champion about how do we revitalize rural America.
Well, there's no more bigger champion actually in Congress than yourself on these issues. I mean, I certainly have appreciated your leadership on the school lunch program, which really I think is helping to create a generational shift in how we eat, and I think it will lead to more fruits and vegetable consumption. But you're right, we do need to revitalize the rural economy, and I think you understand the importance of local and regional food systems, the ability to link more closely and more effectively the production that takes place in any area of the country and those who consume, whether it's a farm-to-school program, which we're expanding because of what you've included in the 5-year farm program, or whether it's creating food hubs where you can aggregate a lot of this locally produced fruits and vegetables and product and then be able to sell it to institutional purchasers of food, whether it's a school or a university or college or a prison or a hospital. It creates new market opportunities, and it's really what brings that entrepreneurship and that innovation back into agriculture. I think California is a great example of that. What's been done with the wine industry, what's been done with the fruits and vegetable industry in your state really is about innovation and entrepreneurship. There are great stories there of families that have come and created these extraordinary orchards and these extraordinary production facilities, starting small and then growing big. And that has to be replayed in other parts of the country. So we're very focused on rebuilding this rural economy to give those young people an opportunity.
I think what's important is these stories. I think people are listening to stories, and we need to have our communications about agriculture told in, for example, restaurants, that the food that they're serving comes from the local area, and mention a little bit about that, so that people get a connection that, oh yes, I just drove through the Salinas Valley or the Pajaro Valley, and I did see all that stuff growing out there, and here it is on my plate. It would be nice if our restaurant industry would give us a little more description of that. And I think what you saw, one of our schools in East Salinas, I've always been concerned that the appreciation for ag labor has never gotten the kinds of appreciation that coal miners get, or that aerospace workers get or automobile workers get, that the sort of the labor force isn't honored in agriculture as it is in other industries. And I saw this school, during the school lunch program, they put up the names of the suppliers. And the kids were saying, you know, my mom works there. My mom was responsible for us having lunch today. I think those are the kinds of stories or communications that we really need to help America understand, that there's a connection between what's on their plate and what's in the field.
Well, those stories are also inspiring. These are families, many of them immigrant families, who are coming into this country, working hard and sacrificing. They not only provide us an extraordinary diversity of food. I mean, we are a food secure nation, which means that we basically grow everything we need to feed ourselves. Hardly any nation on earth can say that. But also, when folks come out of the grocery store, they've actually got more money in their pocket from their paychecks than most anyone else in the world. We only spend 10% of our paychecks for food. And one of the reasons for that is those hardworking farm workers who basically harvest the crop that we enjoy. And I think you're right. I think it's important to tell those stories so that there is a more direct connection with our food supply and a greater appreciation for those who help produce it. And I think if we had that appreciation, it might be a little easier to get that 5-year farm program through the Congress. It might be able to get adequate budget resources to make sure that we have vibrant rural communities.
The biggest struggle when you're in a cut, squeeze, and trim mode, which is Congress is in right now, it's not thinking about investment, it's thinking about how do we cut, is to, and here you are launching a new program, which is this investment in rural America, and not having money to do it, you're going to have to do it by just baling wire and duct tape. I'd also like to put that into context that you as a secretary, more than any of the other secretaries that have come before our committees and appropriations committees, have found within your own department tremendous savings just by smart management. Do you want to tell us how you got there?
Well, first of all, the credit belongs obviously to the folks who work at USDA, but we essentially saw the fiscal challenges that we're now facing a couple of years ago coming down the track, and we basically decided we were going to manage change instead of being managed by change. And we put together what we call the Blueprint for Stronger Service. And we essentially challenged all of our folks to basically take a look at how we spend money, where we spend money, and whether or not we could continue to do the job but do it more efficiently. First thing we found out was that a lot of our workforce was ready to retire, and so we began the process of reconfiguring our workforce, making it a more diverse workforce, but at the same time reducing numbers and trying to find out through process improvement how we could do the same job or more of the same job with fewer people. We were 8% down in terms of our workforce. Then we looked at the number of offices and labs and basically said, look, it'd be great if we could afford all of this, but we can't. What are the most efficiently operated offices and labs? Let's continue to fund those. Then we looked at rental space. We looked at our vehicle maintenance and how often we turned over vehicles. We looked at supply purchases. We looked at technology. We had 833 cell phone contracts. Now, who knew that there were that many cell phone companies? We now have reduced that to below 30, and we saved $6 million. A single email system instead of 11 separate email systems also saves millions of dollars. At the end of the day, and that total is still continuing to rise, we're now at $828 million that we've identified in savings. So when sequester hits or when budget reductions occur, and they have occurred in our discretionary budget, we're in a better position to respond to that challenge without sacrificing service. Now, we're now dealing with a budget, as you well know, that is $1 billion on the discretionary side below what it was when I came into this position. And I think, frankly, my training and experience as a governor in a state where 6 of the 8 years I was governor, we had to deal with less money, probably put me in a position to understand how best to do this and to inspire people to do it.
I'm curious, in cabinet meetings, are you sharing some of your learned lessons about how to do with administrative efficiencies?
Well, the president was very struck by a note that I provided to him in one of the weekly reports we send to the White House about this process, and he asked me to brief the entire cabinet about it. And many of my colleagues are, in fact, asking our people now, what did you do in vehicles? What did you do in supplies? How did you treat technology? What did you do about workforce? And so that process is beginning to ripple through the federal government, which is a good thing. It allows you, as a defender and advocate for these great programs, to be able to say, look, let's not cut programs. Let's continue to encourage the bureaucracy to look differently at the way in which we spend money. And I think people are stepping up. Again, these are folks who haven't had a raise in 3 years. These are folks at USDA now doing more work with fewer people. And so hats off to the folks who are working hard at USDA.
You know, when I speak about this, and because numbers are so big in government expenditures, people just sort of like, well, yeah, that really, you can just absorb it, but they don't realize what it is. I try to remind them, I said, look, we're back to spending, in this budget that we're adopting now is 2000 level. That's 13 years ago. There are some fixed costs that in your own personal budget that you don't have the discretion to cut back on. Your garbage bill's gone up in 13 years. Your cable bill's gone up. Your water bill's gone up. Your electricity bill's gone up. You don't have the opportunity to say, well, we're just going to pay less for those things. So you do have to take it out of personnel, and because you still have these fixed costs that are pretty high.
You've got fixed costs and you have increased need. Take the state of California. Our rural development folks have invested $4.5 billion in the state of California since I've been secretary. Now, those are thousands of home loans, those are hundreds of business loans, those are opportunities in conservation programs in which it requires personnel to basically finance and figure out and do the paperwork necessary to provide those resources that help stimulate the economy. And that $4.5 billion comes into California. It circles around in the economy several times, and that's maybe one of the reasons why California is beginning to come back strong, beginning to, at the state level, to begin to have a budget surplus as opposed to these huge deficits that they've been dealing with. So it requires people to do that, and it requires a process in offices to do that. So the challenge here is to make sure that we do this efficiently without sacrificing the important work that's necessary.
Well, I think what struck me when I got on the Agriculture Committee was learning the diversity of your department. I mean, most people think you're just dealing with food, but the department was created by Abraham Lincoln. It was time in the westward expansion. It was a department that essentially was advising people on how to be pioneers of how to move west, how to be self-sufficient, how to hunt, how to take your killed and process it and eat and cook it and all these things so you have responsibilities for rural water systems and rural electric systems and rural telephone systems and rural housing systems. I mean, it's an amazingly diverse portfolio that the Department of Agriculture has.
It is, and California is probably the best example of a state that uses all of our requirements. And we have the Forest Service, which is obviously critically important in California. We, as you mentioned, we've got all of those rural programs. You earlier mentioned the need for connectivity, Wi-Fi, broadband. We're also engaged in telecommunications and linking up hospitals for distance medicine, telemedicine, schools for distance learning. We've got we've got several ports, obviously, in California. We're heavily engaged, obviously, in agricultural trade, record amount of agricultural trade, much of which is being grown and raised in California. So it is a broad, diverse department, and so when people think of the agricultural department, they think of farmers. The problem with that is that that's less than 1% of the population of America, but we actually serve 100% of the population of America. Even in cities, we have an impact on urban forest and our gardening program that we're trying to encourage, the farmers market expansion, and the school lunch and school breakfast programs, the SNAP program, the WIC program. Those are also urban-centric and urban-centered. So it is a very diverse department, and that's one of the challenges, because we can't message this department in the way the Defense Department messages the important work it does, or the Veterans Administration that has a singular focus on veterans. And that's one of the challenges.
Share with us what you've done with the Rural Council, which is something that the President created, never had one before. It was essentially to focus on how do we, and I think it was all coming from you, how do we revitalize rural America where this poverty is so
well, the reality is that every department of government invests or impacts rural America. The problem has been in the past that we're doing it without knowing what each other is doing. And so in order to leverage, in order to get the most efficient use of dollars, you have to have communication. You have to have a connection between what the Health and Human Services Department is doing in expanding access to health care under the Affordable Care Act and our ability to provide telemedicine, or the Department of Labor's ability to provide workforce training on hospital technology. You have to know what the Veterans Administration is doing, because so many of these veterans do indeed come from those rural communities. How are the services going to be made available to those folks who are in remote rural areas? And so the Rural Council is designed to basically create a process in which we can talk to one another and begin to coordinate our efforts. So, for example, the Department of Commerce and the USDA work together to create a job accelerator in rural America. We put our resources together and we ask communities and regions across the country, if you had so many dollars, what would you do with it to help create economic opportunity quickly? And we had, a number of applications that we eventually funded and provided millions of dollars to stimulate job creation. We worked with the Department of Interior to create this regulatory certainty concept in which the Endangered Species Act, which impacts and affects a lot of the United States, we essentially said, look, if USDA uses its conservation money, can the Department of Interior provide certainty to those producers that if they invest those resources in conservation, they won't have to worry about the Endangered Species Act with reference to the sage grouse. That's working. It's providing great activity. So a way of coordinating our resources and coming up with innovative ways to combine and to integrate and coordinate what every department does for rural America.
But also a focus on revitalization of how do you keep people in those, how do you make that town that's dying? I think you said you turned to the census data and found the poorest counties in the United States.
We did, and actually 90% of the poorest areas in the country are in rural areas. Persistently poor counties are rural counties in nature. So we've created a thing called Strike Force at USDA where we're providing intensive care to those counties, reaching in and basically understanding that they're not particularly sold on government. They don't see government helping them. So we align ourselves with the community.
And part of that is not even having the capacity to know how to ask for help.
That's exactly right. That is a big part of it. So we align ourselves with a community building organization and basically train and equip and educate them about how to play the game, how to apply successfully for grants under our community facility program or a loan for business development, and we show them the pathway to success which they can then replicate. It's been extraordinarily successful. We've seen increases in housing, we've seen increases in conservation spending, we've seen increased credit for farmers, for particularly socially disadvantaged farmers, and we've also seen an expansion of business opportunities. So it's obviously working.
Well, what has been your biggest surprise in taking over this responsibility for such a diverse department? And then on top of that, having these ideas about how to revitalize America. Is there, I mean, coming as a governor from Iowa and handling all these day-to-day issues that you have to do in a state like that, what was the biggest surprise about Washington?
Honestly, I was a governor, and our legislature all the time I was governor was controlled by Republicans, and so we actually had to get along. We had to balance a budget. We had to get things done. I don't know if it's a surprise, but I'd say the frustration is watching somebody like yourself who genuinely wants to work with folks on the other side, sometimes having a hard time doing that, because you don't have a receptive audience to collaboration and compromise. The great thing about the Ag Committee is if there is one committee in Congress or one area of the immense work that you all are doing where compromise is possible, it's probably in the Ag area. That's why I'm hopeful that we get this food farm and jobs bill through the process, because I think that might create some momentum to then do immigration, which is extremely important to agriculture, and that may then provide you the opportunity to do more work on the fiscal issues, so we get away from this sequester, which is really bad policy, and have a more longer-term view of how best to get this country in the best fiscal shape that it can get in.
You know, the agriculture that I represent is almost $5 billion in just a little small area of California. I mean, it's very, very productive agriculture, and obviously very dependent on exports. We send our agriculture all over the world. But what we're really trying to do is get our agriculture into all the institutions, is into all the feeding programs, particularly school lunch and institutions. We have the largest prison in the United States, I think, and we have a combined state prison there, two prisons combined. We used to have one of the largest military bases in the United States, but you think about all this kind of need to feed institutional folks. And you're very involved in nutrition, and is there for a moment just an agenda to try to get up? I think we learned in the healthcare bill that if we're really going to raise a healthier country, we've got to raise healthier people, and that's got to start with food and exercise.
Well, I think one of the things that the Congress from 2009-2010 can be proudest of is the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, which was passed with bipartisan support, that basically began that generational shift in terms of what we eat and how we eat. I mean, we're basically now having young people in schools having meals that are balanced with more fruits and vegetables, more dairy, more whole grain, less fat, less sodium, less sugar, and we're growing a generation of kids that are going to be making some interesting choices. We're changing what's in the vending machines so that that package of almonds may replace that Snickers bar. Nothing against candy, but it's probably not the right place for it to be in a vending machine in a school. If it's a treat that mom and dad want to provide, fine. But I think it's important to help foster this generational shift, because we've got a third of our kids who are obese or overweight. That challenges our national security, because we have an all-volunteer Army and we don't have that many kids now physically fit to be able to go into the military. We also have 17 million children from families that are food insecure. So the combination of kids who are hungry and kids who are worried about their self-esteem, it impacts and affects their education and their educational achievement. There's research on that. That impacts our competitiveness in the long run as an economy. You've mentioned healthcare. If we think our healthcare costs are high today, wait till we have this generation of kids who are obese and overweight with chronic diseases going into adulthood. So we've got to address this. And the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act was one way. Reformulating the WIC program, a directive from you and members of Congress to basically make that package that we provide to young moms and young children more nutritious, expand their choices, not just focus on what they traditionally eat, but inject leafy greens into the mix, fruits and vegetables with color into the mix, which obviously plays the strength of your district.
Yeah, we've gotten our counties to be involved in carrying the WIC vouchers to the women who are entitled to them to the farmers markets.
Right.
They show up, here's your name, here's your voucher, go spend it on all of these vendors here. And the vendors tell me in some of these markets that 65% of their income comes from those vouchers. So they're working. And this is really a wonderful connection of disposable income being used to help the local economy and local small farmers.
You also saw the foresight of using SNAP and encouraging the EPT, the Electronic Benefit Transfer Card, to be used at farmers markets. We now got 2,800 farmers markets, explosion of activity there, to allow SNAP beneficiaries to also have the opportunity to partake in a farmers market. You've got foundations providing double bucks opportunities for people to expand, and we're working on a healthy financing and food initiative in Holyoke to encourage SNAP beneficiaries to make the right choices in terms of fruits and vegetables. So I think you're going to see a lot of activity in this space.
I could speak to you for days, and I just love your service to our country, and I want to appreciate publicly about how much I admire your leadership in the Department of Agriculture as our secretary. Thank you for being on my program.
You bet. Thank you.
For more information, contact one of Congressman Farr's district offices. You can also reach Congressman Farr in Washington or visit his website.